Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're reviewing Kyle Anderson's season. He went from a career best scoring year the year prior to struggling at times, to put it mildly, but still an important part of the Wolves team this year. What's his future with Minnesota? I also want to talk about Nickeil Alexander-Walker. He did have a career year for the Wolves this season. We'll break it all down on the show here today. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Happy Tuesday, everybody. And I want to spend today reviewing two key bench players for Minnesota. This is the midst of our player review series. We're about exactly halfway through. And we're to the, in some order, 7th and 8th guys on the rotation, on the depth chart, however you want to say it, for Minnesota. Today, we'll talk about Kyle Anderson and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And Kyle Anderson, for his part, the year prior, 22-23, his first year in Minnesota, had what we could consider a career year in terms of efficiency. He shot his best three-point percentage of his career. He had an effective field goal percentage that rivaled some of his prime years back in San Antonio and Memphis. But then this year, he took a step back. We'll talk about what happened and why that was the case, and what, could he possibly be back? What's his value? Does he price himself out of Minnesota's range, or is he already priced outside of Minnesota's range given the lack of cap space? And then also we'll talk about Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Nickeil did have a career season this year for Minnesota, and he's got another year left on his deal at a very affordable price. We'll talk about all that on the show here today. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. That's with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, so let's start with Slo-Mo. And we've actually talked quite a bit over the last week or so about Kyle Anderson. He was a primary topic early last week when I talked about the overall salary situation as, the one member of the top 8 in the rotation that's likely to move on next season. And then we also talked about him in regard to the playmaking conversation, because Jordan McLaughlin, Monte Morris are both free agents along with Kyle Anderson this offseason. And all three of them are not going to be back. Might two of them be back? Might only one of them? Might none of them be back? And Kyle Anderson, even though he's not a true point guard, falls into that conversation. Weirdly, he's part of the big man conversation. He's part of the wing conversation. He's also part of the point guard conversation, simply because, Chris Finch has called him many times his Swiss Army knife on both ends of the floor. And while that's the case, this was the worst year Kyle Anderson's had in at least a couple. It was certainly worse than his first year in Minnesota, right? He averaged a 6.4 points per game, which is, of course, a terrible way to measure a player's success, but that's his lowest in 5 years since his second year in Memphis, and the, third lowest since he was barely a rotation player in San Antonio. Shooting-wise, Kyle Anderson went from shooting 46% from the floor last year overall to 51% for the floor last year overall to 46% this year. So a 5% dip in field goal percentage. Again, not the number one way to measure a player's offensive effectiveness, but a 5% dip is a stark thing. Now, also related, last year was in a lot of ways, as I mentioned off the top, a career year in terms of efficiency. He shot 51% for the field. The year prior in Memphis, he was under 45%, which is even worse than this year. And also from outside the arc, last year, Kyle Anderson shot a career best 41%. It was low volume. It was only 1.5 attempts per game, and it was almost entirely from the corners. This is the 22-23 season. But this last year was actually his career worst shooting season, even worse than his rookie season, second-year season in San Antonio when he was 27%, whatever. This year is 23% from outside the arc, and the attempts went down to about a half attempt per game. So nearly 1 attempt less per game this year from outside the arc. And it was to the point, like last season, 22-23, teams were leaving him open, but the Wolves were more than happy for him to take those corner threes. And this year, the teams were leaving him open, and he wasn't taking them because he knew he wasn't going to make them. Unfortunately, he shot, again, just 23% from outside the arc, which was again, low volume, but an 18% dip, an 18% cratering from the year prior. Overall from the field, 5% less. His effective field goal percentage was about 8 points less than it was the year prior. He shot the ball worse from the free throw line as well, below his career average slightly. So shooting wise, it was a really rough season for Kyle Anderson. There's no sugarcoating that at all. However, one could argue that his defense was just as important, if not more important. And he was being asked to do a little bit less defensively because of the full season addition to Nickeil Alexander-Walker, the increased minutes for Reid. Kyle Anderson got bumped from playing most of his minutes at the 4 to playing a lot of minutes at the 3 this year. He still played the 4 a fair amount because of, the Karl-Anthony Towns injury was a big reason why the overall numbers appeared that he was at the 4 more often when Cat missed, whatever it was from March into April, however many games that ended up being. But he played a lot more at the 3. In fact, more than half his minutes at the 3 this season, according to, actually a couple different places would have him 50 to 60% of his minutes at the 3. After last year, the season before, 90% of his minutes were at the 4. So Kyle Anderson playing the 3 does a couple of things. One, in theory, it could put him in a tougher spot defensively because you're going to have to play somebody who's got, likely more shooting capability, be able to stretch the floor more, certainly more athleticism, being able to do more off the dribble. And then offensively, if he's actually playing the 3, that means you probably have at least, you might have 2 guys on the floor if he's out there with Rudy Gobert who can't shoot 3s. And it puts more pressure on your bigs to shoot 3s and also be active on the glass. And Kyle Anderson, even though technically there's less pressure for him to be on the glass at the 3, he was way less on the glass this year. His rebounding rate dipped to a by far career low. Last year was his previous career low, by the way. So I thought defensively he was just as valuable simply because of what he was being asked to do, which was a little bit of everything. Offensively, so much more of his value this season was in distributing the basketball, was in being really a point forward for Minnesota. And sometimes he was really playing point guard, especially after Shake Milton got off to a rough start this season. Jordan McLaughlin had some injuries and then wasn't trusted for a stretch of time. It was basically Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Kyle Anderson sharing playmaking duties with the second unit. And Kyle Anderson was great when he was, say, a zone buster. Teams stopped playing zones. I'd be willing to bet that opposing teams played less zone this year against Minnesota than in the 22-23 season. Part of it was the overall shooting capability of the roster improved. The Wolves ended up as the 3rd best 3-point shooting team of any team in the NBA, which I know the way that they finished the season against Dallas kind of may obscure that fact, but they were a great 3-point shooting team. And also, frankly, because Kyle Anderson was so good at busting the zone, just getting into the middle, everybody else had to be guarded. And teams would concede that 12, 15-footer push shot from Kyle Anderson. He made it enough to keep teams somewhat honest. But even if the scouting report said, hey, get off a soft contest, close out to the touch and try and make Slo-Mo make a contested 14, 15-footer, it's a defender's natural reaction to this guy's open to the free throw line. I've got to guard him. So a lot of times the Wolves, if teams try to play a zone, would get open 3-point shots or backdoor cuts, baseline cutters, simply because teams were overreacting to Kyle Anderson getting into the middle of the defense, when in reality, they'd be better off just like, hey, let's try and make this guy shoot a contested free throw line jumper. But all that to say, Kyle Anderson was really, really impactful in those situations. And he was still I wouldn't call him a plus offensive player, but a close to neutral offensive player for Minnesota at times this year because of that. If he could have shot 3s anywhere near what he did last year, even if it was only 1 attempt per game, that would have made a world of difference. And some of Minnesota's struggles offensively this year, I don't want to put too much on Kyle Anderson, but you could trace it to the difference in what Slo-Mo was able to do in 22-23 and what he was able to do in 23-24. Now, the Timberwolves were still a better offensive team this year, and they obviously were a better overall team. They won 56 games. They went to the conference finals. So we're nitpicking a little here. But when we're looking at issues Minnesota had offensively, one of them was Slo-Mo lineups just didn't always have the right mix or the right pace, or Slo-Mo was playing at his own pace and other guys weren't necessarily spacing the way that they needed to. And Kyle Anderson, again, an impactful player overall, but the offensive game at times was really, really rough around the edges for Slo-Mo. Last season, he had his highest turnover rate in 3 seasons and the 3rd highest of his career. This year was only a 1/10 of a percentage point better. He went from 15.7% turnover rate last year to 15.6% this year. Now, the assist rate did go up, and that was big, and that more than offsets the turnover issues. But that is still something that, as the ball has been in his hands more often the last couple of seasons, has been an issue. I want to talk a little more Slo-Mo and, again, kind of underscore what he was best at and the differences between last year and this year. And then we'll transition to talking about Nickeil Alexander-Walker. We go from a guy who likely won't be on the team this year in Kyle Anderson or this coming year to somebody who certainly will be, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Will do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more, and you can bet it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet on everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park on the diamond. Right now, of course, Dallas is in a 2-0 hole, or an 0-2 hole, I guess, in the NBA Finals. They are favorites going back home for Game 3 on Wednesday night. They are 1.5-point favorites at home. And if you want the money line for Boston, plus 108, that doesn't look bad. Now, I think Dallas is going to win one of the two at home. Is it more likely they win Game 1 or Game 3 than Game 4? Probably. So I don't know. Dallas minus 1.5 or at minus 114, or Boston money line plus 108. I could go either way on that, really. So go check that out on FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so Kyle Anderson, defensively this year, I thought had a really positive impact on the Timberwolves' overall team defense. He was being asked, even though he played more at the 3, I thought he was asked less frequently to guard more on the perimeter. And I mentioned this a little bit off the top. Because of the presence of Nickeil Alexander-Walker, because of the increased trust with Jaden McDaniels, and also the increased or the improved defense, continuously improving defense from Anthony Edwards, Kyle Anderson was asked less often this year to guard guys who clearly had a leg up athletically, or players that maybe had a lateral quickness that Slo-Mo may struggle to stay in front of. That happened less often, and his team defense was every bit as good, if not better, than it always has been. Block rate was similar. Steal rate was up slightly. Again, defensive rebounding was down a little. I think it's because he was on the perimeter a little bit more frequently. Or I should say, let me rephrase that. I realize it sounds like I contradicted myself. I think he was overall on the perimeter more frequently, but the Timberwolves were able to pick and choose what defensive assignment they gave him because they had more talent around him. So it wasn't like they were, hey, shoot, we're playing this really athletic 2 or 3. We got to put Slo-Mo on him. They had like 4 other options before Slo-Mo. So they weren't hiding Kyle Anderson, but they could give him, a less high or a lower usage offensive player, maybe somebody who's more of a spot up 3-point shooter, etc. It allowed Kyle Anderson to roam a little bit. And when he was in lineups without Rudy Gobert on the floor, so if he was playing the 3 a lot of times he was playing the 3 with Gobert and either Towns or Naz at the 4. But if he was on the floor at the 4, they could put him on, if he was the only non-shooter on the floor offensively and at the 4 and Cat or Naz at the 5, then they could give him the Rudy role almost. And he was essentially the low man, and he could guard the guy in the corner, get out and contest. And he was so good at that. And because his basketball IQ is so good and he's so long and so savvy, he was able to plug passing lanes. He was able to provide some a little bit of rim protection, at least some resistance in the paint because of his size and his savvy. And we know that some of the best minutes of his career have been a small ball 5. And so he was effectively playing the 5 defensively in some of those lineups. And he was really, really good in that role. But again, occasionally he was on the perimeter contesting more often because he was playing more three, even if he wasn't guarding point of attack or he wasn't guarding these athletic ball handlers like he was kind of forced to do a couple of years ago or a year before this one. So overall, that improved his defensive impact. I thought Kyle Anderson was very good defensively. And I tried to kind of parse this a little about a week ago with how do the Wolves backfill his minutes if he leaves? And what would the Wolves be missing with Kyle Anderson? Well, it's clearly what they'd be missing defensively more than offensively, because even though you lose that playmaking ability, playmaking for others, not for himself, and they've got to figure out backup point guard. If they do find somebody, they have a backup point guard that comes in, they acquire somebody, they have Nickeil Alexander-Walker, they are able to kind of cobble together some bench playmaking. It's not going to take that much to do better than what Slo-Mo was offensively last year. I know the playmaking is valuable, but when it comes to zero shooting and very little scoring overall, it becomes less valuable. And I think the Wolves can backfill that. Defensively is where the Swiss Army knife-ness of Kyle Anderson is really going to be missed if he is indeed gone next year. Because he could guard essentially 2 through 4 comfortably in some 1s and 5s. And it hurts to lose somebody with that size and that level of savvy and that level of a team defender from the number 1 defense in the league and one of the best defense in the last 20 years. He's not an insignificant piece to replace. And whether if you plug in Leonard Miller offensively, you're not going to get the same level of playmaking right away, at least not without a lot of mistakes from a 21-year-old who's never really played in the NBA. But you're going to get a lot more punch offensively. You're going to get more offensive rebounding. You're going to get, just more upside. But defensively, I mean, Leonard Miller is a guy who has to prove his motor. He has to prove that he's a good team defender, a consistent on-ball defender. He doesn't fall asleep off the ball. All things that were concerns coming out of the draft for Leonard Miller. And I'm not sure he's necessarily, calmed those fears after 1 year in and out of the G League and garbage minutes in the NBA. Or how, if it's Josh Minott, who's obviously a very different player, however the Wolves fill those minutes. Defensively, that's going to be a bigger challenge than on the offensive side. Again, because at best, Kyle Anderson was a net neutral, and a lot of the plus-minus data would argue he was a negative offensively, but defensively was really impactful. And I don't think there's any question about that. And even though somebody like Leonard Miller or Josh Minott's going to have more athleticism and likely more rebounding chops from day one, they're not going to always be in the right position. They're not going to talk with the same level of, with the same voice, the same impact as a Kyle Anderson. So that's where my concern lies if he is indeed gone. And he very likely is pricing himself or will be priced outside of Minnesota's range. I mean, the contract he had this last year in Minnesota, I mean, what did he sign? A 2-year, it's like a 2-year, 17, 18, 2 years, 18-ish million. Yeah, 2 years, 18 million. So this last year he made 9.2. I don't think he makes that much at his next contract, but this is likely his last sizable deal where he can make somewhere near that 9 million, whether it's 6, 7 million. The Wolves aren't going to probably be able to go above about 5 with that mid-level exception. And I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if Chris Finch fought for Kyle Anderson at that price, and maybe he takes a little less to stay in Minnesota because he knows he can succeed. He's comfortable. He's been in the city for a couple of years. He's been with this team, but this might be his last chance to make 7 or 8 million on the open market. And maybe it's a 1 year, more likely than not, he's looking for a multi-year deal as he kind of exits his prime. Not that, I mean, he's also a player who should age decently since there's not a whole lot of athleticism that he relies on. But very curious to see what that looks like for Slo-Mo on the open market. But the defensive side is where I worry the most. Let's transition into Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Nickeil, of course, was the throw-in, and I talked about him. I haven't gone back. I don't really want to go back and listen to what I said a year and a half ago. The Wolves acquired him because I wasn't all. He really was more of a throw-in. At least that's how he was discussed after that trade. If you go back and watch, listen, or read any content from post-trade deadline in 2023, it was all about Mike Conley and D'Angelo Russell and those guys, and even the picks. Nickeil Alexander-Walker was kind of an afterthought as a former lottery pick who, was expected to do more. I guess he wasn't lottery. He was just outside the lottery. 17th overall. He was expected to do more from day one in the league with New Orleans and then traded to Utah and was seen as somebody who, because of the athleticism, if he could figure out a shot and score a little more off the dribble, there was so much upside. And it just never happened. When the Wolves acquired him, he was out of the rotation with the Utah Jazz, was playing 10 minutes a game when he did play, came to Minnesota and immediately, like 2 games in, was in the Timberwolves rotation, shut down his cousin SGA, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, in the play-in last season, And then this year was in the rotation from day one and averaged a career high in minutes per game, averaged the most points per game in 3 years in his career. Shot the best 3-point percentage of any season in his career, 39.1% from outside the arc. He's a career 35% 3-point shooter. And, along with it, a bunch of other stuff too. Best free throw shooting year of his career. Not like he shot a ton of free throws, but best effective field goal percentage of his career. The shooting is coming around, and he's clearly more comfortable as a player at the NBA level than he was, just a couple of years ago. I want to talk about the overall impact he had on the Wolves this year, what I see his role being next year. And, he didn't close the season great. I want to dig a bit into some of the B-ball index numbers on his shooting impact for Minnesota and why his bench production is going to be really important next year for Minnesota. So we'll get into all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at BetterHelp. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. We all carry around different stressors, big and small. When we keep them bottled up, it can start to affect us negatively. Therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever might be weighing you down. And there's a lot of serious things out there, and basketball maybe isn't it's not the most important thing, but it's a really important thing. And look, a lot of our moods can be affected by what happens on the basketball court. And I'm happy that the Boston Celtics are up in this series 2-0 in the NBA Finals because they were the best team in the NBA all season long. They had the playoff issues last year and in recent years, and people just kind of thought they were pretenders, but they were clearly the best team in the NBA. And the Wolves matched up pretty well against them. 2 overtime games. They won one. They lost one on the road. They won at home. They lost on the road. And one of the most fun moments of the season, that overtime win back in early November at Target Center. I wanted Dallas because of the way they fairly easily dispatched to Minnesota ultimately in the conference finals. I thought Dallas would put up a bit more of a fight. So it bugs me a little that they're not. I think they will. I think they'll win at least one in Dallas, and I think this thing might still go 6. But I am happy for Boston. Look, like I said, there's a lot of more important things in the world than worrying about what's happening in the NBA Finals, especially if you're not a Boston fan or a Dallas fan. But look, therapy looks different for everyone. If you're thinking of starting therapy, consider giving BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get started and get matched with a licensed therapist. Switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, as we said, a career shooting season for him, most minutes per game he's played, and his best defensive year of his career, no question. And we talked a lot last offseason about ball screen navigation. And for whatever reason, B-Ball Index, those numbers aren't pulling for me, the ball screen navigation numbers. There's other places you can find it. But last year, the 22-23 season, Jaden McDaniels was the very best in the entire league in ball screen navigation. Nickeil Alexander-Walker was like 97th percentile. And that was on full display against the best pick and roll team in the league, the Denver Nuggets, in the second round of the playoffs. Those guys were all over the place. And Nickeil Alexander-Walker got his moment nationally. Everybody knows his name. John Hollinger loves to talk about him on The Athletic and on podcasts. Basketball fans now, not just Minnesota fans, know who Nickeil Alexander-Walker is because of the defense he played on Jamal Murray when he picked him up at the timeline or in the backcourt, and then was bumping him at the timeline and the smile on his face when he was laughing and just enjoying it. Unfortunately, that was kind of the peak of the playoffs for Alexander-Walker. He went into this big shooting slump. He struggled a little defensively against Dallas, frankly. That was weird. It was uncharacteristic. But he is fantastic at navigating ball screens. He also, on B-Ball Index, finished in the 98th percentile of defensive miles per 75 possessions, or defensive miles traveled per 75 possessions. So he's all over the place. He's picking guys up 3/4 court. He's aggressive, pressing up on ball handlers. He's getting over screens and around screens and through screens. He does all of the above defensively, and he was awesome this year defensively for Minnesota. He's a little small to guard, the big guys like Luka, to guard the big guards, the big wings. But for a more traditional size point guard, even in this year's NBA or today's NBA, as a point of attack defender, he's fantastic and was able to take a lot of miles off Mike Conley by doing that throughout the season. And he's really good off the ball too, but the best use for him is as a point of attack defender. And if he just does that, he's a plus player. It was a benefit this year that he had a career shooting year from outside the arc. Again, 39.1% from three. And the year prior, he was 38.4%. So even though his career mark is 35%, he struggled his first 3 years in the league. His last two, this may not be an outlier. He might be a 38+% three-point shooter. Now, we saw him overall struggle in the playoffs in terms of his three-point shot. Well, really, he was just more streaky than anything else. He finished at 29.6% in the playoffs, which is not good over 16 games, obviously. But he had that really hot stretch. He had a couple great games against Phoenix. He had, I think, one really good game against Denver and then struggled against Dallas. The volume for him was huge in the playoffs. 81 three-point attempts over 16 games, which works out to, without doing quick math, I'm going to look at the per game because that'll be better. 5.1 three-point attempts per game in the playoffs, which is about 1 3 per game more than what he averaged in the regular season. And I talked about it at the start of the playoffs. I thought both Phoenix and Denver would give up some corner threes to Minnesota, and it was going to be huge. Sure enough, it was massive against Phoenix and impactful at times against Denver, although he had a couple of stinkers mixed in there too. If he could just be a little bit less streaky from outside the arc, that's going to take him from nice role player, seventh man type guy to like a starting caliber player. Now, he doesn't need to be a starter on this Wolves team, but it would be great if he could become a little better above the break, a little bit more consistent and less streaky. Overall, this season above the break, he was only 33% on above the break threes, which is 53rd percentile. So a very average above the break three-point shooter. From the corners, he was 43%. That's 74th percentile according to B-Ball Index. Catch and shoot, 40.4%. That's 79th percentile. Pull-up threes, which he didn't shoot a ton of, he was only 29%. So, and a lot of times, you know, well, all the time, pretty much, pull-up threes are going to be above the break. So above the break, pull-up threes. Nickeil is really your catch and shoot three-point guy, and he got better at pump faking and getting to the rim and scoring in the paint. He had a couple of nice, tough layups in that Dallas series when the three-point shot wasn't falling. That's kind of the next frontier for Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and he's still very young. He turns 26 in early September, so he'll be 26 at the start of next season, and this is the second year of that 2-year deal he signed last offseason. Remember, I didn't even think they were going to get to keep him last year. And they got to bring him back for 2 years and what? 2 years and $9 million. So he made 4.6, almost 4.7 last year. His salary actually goes down to 4.3 this year. And he's going to make, if he has this same year, like if he was a free agent this offseason, he makes at least twice that. He's at least an $8-9 million player. He probably gets more than Slo-Mo, frankly. If he has this year again, going into his age 27 season, he's going to be a highly sought-after free agent and be well priced out of what Minnesota is able to afford. It's going to be a challenge to keep him past this season. But the good news is they do have him for this season. And if he turns in the exact same season with just a little more consistency, maybe a little bit better above the break, but the same defensive performance, and really he looked worn down in the conference finals. I know almost everyone did, and it's a long season, and clearly there's two teams in the finals that are also tired and they made it work. So I'm not making excuses, but maybe it's a conditioning thing. Maybe it's, you know, whatever. I know he had the shoulder issue too. I shouldn't discount that. That certainly had something to do, I'm sure, with some of the struggles he had late Denver and into the Dallas series. But that version of Nickeil, the early playoffs version, and what we saw from most of the regular season is worth so much more than $4.3 million, what he's getting paid next year. He is a true seventh man on this team. After Naz, he's the most impactful bench player for sure. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he turns into. I'm not looking forward to him being priced out of the Wolves range next summer, but let's enjoy one more season of Nickeil Alexander-Walker and give props where props are due to Tim Conley for asking and getting Nickeil Alexander-Walker in that Mike Conley, D'Angelo Russell trade, plus a couple of second-round picks too. All right, that's all we have for you today. Wednesday's show, we're going to go into Naz Reid. I may do a whole show on Naz. It'll either be a whole show or a half show on Naz Reid, and we'll get into the starting lineup then. And, you know, really by the first part of next week, we'll spend the next week and a half. We'll mix in a lot of draft coverage. It'll be primarily draft coverage as we get ready. The Wolves actually have 2 picks this year, 27 and 37. So lots of draft coverage upcoming. But again, finishing the player review series, 6 players to go. Naz and the starters is where we'll head next. So a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CK. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.